Okay, good evening everybody. Hi. So nice to see so many familiar and new faces. Thank you for coming out this evening to what is the third event in our Exploring Radical Female Joy programme that I have curated with Unit London. And tonight we're talking about collectives and collecting, and it's amazing to see such an audience with an appetite to come and think about feminist networks and kinships and ways of being together on a rainy November night. So thank you for being here. Before I introduce the panel and hand over really to a discussion with them, there's just a few themes I wanted to situate us in for this evening. We're thinking about this idea of collectives and female collectives coming together. And there are a few historical examples that really informed my thinking in putting this event together. And if I could get the first slide. So one of the groups that really inspired today's event is A.I.R. A.I.R. Gallery, who celebrated their 50th birthday in September. So they're by no means the definitive female artist collective that we're going to talk about, but they are a really topical and chronological example because they just celebrated a 50-year anniversary. So they opened in 1972 in New York City, 20 founding members. It was the first women's cooperative art space that had a radical new way of being in the art world. There was no director. The 20 founding members all worked together, devoted their own time. I think there was some subscription model. No one paid more money than anyone else. And artists got 100% of the sale of work. So it was a really radically inspired and quite political way of women coming together and finding ways of showing their work, selling their work. And based on this horizontal principle, where there isn't the hierarchy of having a gallery director or a leader. Now, I think this is a portrait by Sylvia Slee, who later joined the group. On the right-hand side is the first brochure from the group, produced by the group for their first show, and it was made to imitate the New York Times. So it was that kind of format with this idea that women have arrived in the art world in this new way, and this is news. And I think the next slide should have a couple of interesting quotes. Yeah, so I thought these were really useful. I leave for you to read them yourselves. But specifically the one by Rosemary Meyer, which is on the right. So Rosemary Meyer was one of the founding members, sister of Bernadette Meyer, some of you might be familiar with, the poet. And she talks about this kind of rare opportunity for women artists to show their work without it having to be really great. And I'm really interested in this idea. The kind of possibility for women to be mediocre, to not always be under pressure to produce the great definitive work, nor to produce work in a vein that had been established preceding them, having to conform to some predetermined idea of what women's work is. So I'm really, really interested in this idea of this freedom that can come from collectives when women come together and choose new ways that don't really have to be about excellence and greatness, but can be about experimentation. So, and then Lucy Lippard, who is the critic, curator, writer, who wrote an essay about A.I.R. By the way, they called themselves A.I.R. Because of the buildings that they occupied in New York. Disused loft spaces, large buildings with different apartments within them, and the stipulations of the New York Fire Department were that you had to have a notification that someone was in the building for emergency measures. So A.I.R. stood for Artist in Residence. So that was where that acronym comes from. But it also related to, according to apocryphal histories and mythologies of the founding moment, it was also related to Jane Eyre. It's this idea of women's identity in literature. So what Lucy Lippard talks about is the way in which a gallery can be built from scratch and be a respected place for women to operate in. And really this idea of recognition of women as a powerful creative force, powerful enough to change the art world. And so I'm interested in this idea as well this evening. So I'm just seeding these ideas that we'll pick up on as the discussion continues. Okay, so the next slide, this is another strand, which is the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective. And while I mention this, I must also acknowledge the really wonderful work that has gone on in recent years by historians and scholars and researchers and writers within uncovering this history of Italian feminisms. And for that, really, it's Alexis Martinez Rowe, who produced a short film called Circolo della Rosa, which this is still from, Helena Reckitt and the Feminist Durations Reading Group, who've organised numerous conferences around Italian feminisms, and artist Claire Fontaine. And what I'm really interested in within this collective is the idea of entrustment and this principle of something called affidamento. And I think we're going to talk about this idea of entrustment later on this evening and what that might mean within a collective, or what that might mean for just coming together and being together. So entrustment was a politically oriented way of narrating one's life to another woman, specifically to another woman within these groups that were instigated by the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective that came out of the Libreria delle Donne, so the women's bookstore in Milan in 1975. If anyone wants to set up something similar here, come and talk to me afterwards, because I would love to set up a women's bookstore. And what I think is really interesting about this kind of way of operating as a collective, it's about recognizing differences. So we go from this very horizontal idea of being together with no leader, to recognizing that we are all different. We come from different backgrounds. We come with different subjectivities. We come with different places of marginalization, and to see that not as a way of dissembling, but as a form of strength. And that's something that I'm really interested in exploring further, and seeing how we can build with trust a way of overcoming differences. And then the final strand that I wanted to think about on the next slide is another Italian movement called Rivolta Femminile, which oriented around the figure of Carla Lonzi. And this was an insistence on being separate. And so that's just another way of being, and I wonder if we can all collectively think about these different strands of being together collectively. So for Carla Lonzi and Rivolta Femminile, they insisted on women only talking to women, only being with women, occupying the margins, staying in the margins, separating themselves from the art world, even deculturalizing themselves, sort of forgetting everything that a male-dominated culture had established about what it meant to be female. And so this is another kind of way of dropping out, of being outside of the system. So 3 different strands that I wanted to seed as a way of exploring some of the ideas we're going to think about tonight. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Rachel Warriner, who joins us from the Courtauld Institute, who's going to talk to us a bit about the problematic histories and emphasize that the importance of thinking about the problems of collectives and how it's okay for there to be problems, and this being something constructive. So over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. I think it was really interesting to hear. Is this working? I don't know. Good. Okay. It was really interesting to hear those kind of thoughts on collective practice and how it might work. So, just to give you a bit about me, I am an art historian and a researcher. I work in the field, and my research on women's art in the 1970s, particularly in the United States. So I'm going to focus on the United States in the next sort of 10 minutes to just give you some sense of different approaches and different ideas relating to collectivity as it emerges in the women's artist movement in the 1970s. So could I have the next slide, please? Lovely, thank you. So I wanted to start, problems are absolutely something that I'm interested in and want to think about, but I'm also interested in why people work together, what it is they think they get out of it, why it's worth what is often a lot of hassle, a lot of bother, and a lot of arguments. And so I wanted to start with this quote from Sherry Gork, who is a West Coast-based feminist artist working out of the Women's Building in Los Angeles, and involved in a number of collaborative projects, which we'll come to in a little while. But she claims that for her, the collaboration is a sort of mathematical formula where 1 + 1 = 3. So there is this kind of notion of an excess that comes with working together, where if you collaborate, you gain something that is more than the sum of its parts. It's not just about working with somebody else, it's about the space between you and how that adds to a process. And I think one of the things that for me is really striking in the women's movement and in these collective projects is the optimism and enthusiasm, the hope that comes from seeing other people and wanting to work with them, often for political change. And I think that has to be kept central in advance of discussing problems and difficulties, because I think that utopian drive that comes with looking to work together is absolutely central to its operation and its structures. So I just want to start with a note of optimism. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I wanted to look at 3 different reasons why people might work together, particularly as it happens in the States in the 70s. And the first one is activism. So one of the groups that I look at are called the Ad Hoc Women Artists Committee, who are formed in 1970 by a group including Faith Ringgold, Poppy Johnson, and Brenda Miller, and they have a very direct interest in changing a very specific thing, which is the representation of women in the New York art world, particularly in the Whitney Annual. So in 1968, the Whitney Annual has been 95.5% men and 4.5% women, and the defense is we only pick the best. Members of the Ad Hoc Women Artists Committee question this logic. They ask how it is at all possible that the best are always almost all men, almost all white men, so they start campaigning against the Whitney for better representation. Michelle Wallace, who is a member of the group Women and Student Artists for Black Art Liberation, gives a formula for how these things should be divided. She says it should be 50% women, 50% artists of colour, and 25% students, arguing that that is the actual makeup of the art world, and therefore that is what we should be seeing on the walls of museums and galleries. So the Ad Hoc Women Artists Committee are a group of women who are interested in how the art world treats women. They're not working together to make art, but instead it's about protest and change. This is a photograph taken from a sit-in that happens at the launch of the Whitney Annual in 1970. They also do a number of other activist actions. They put boiled and raw eggs around the gallery with 50% women written on them, sanitary towels, and they protest on the outside of the gallery as well, putting projections of women's work on the outside of the gallery, making the point that there's none inside. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. They also fake some press releases and invitations around the launch of the annual. So they get in with these false invitations that they make themselves in order to stage the sit-in. But they also bravely announce that the Whitney Annual is going to be 50% women, using the language of that other kind of collective enterprise, the institution, in order to make their point that this is absolutely outrageous. No, it doesn't really come to anything because nobody believes it, because it's so unlikely that the Whitney will actually give 50% representation to women that everyone assumes it's to do with activism and not actually a real promise that's coming from the Whitney. It's not the only museum that is doing similar kind. This is a pretty standard level of representation for women in the 1970s, and other museums also see this kind of action. But the Whitney is a particular focus because it claims to be this survey of everything that's good in the art world and everything that's contemporary in the art world, and they are excluding actively women and artists of colour. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. That latter point around artists of colour's representation is picked up by women students and artists for Black Art Liberation, a group including Faith Ringgold and her daughter Michelle Wallace, as well as some other students who kind of come in and out. They make this point for quotas because they say that that's the only way that museums and institutions can be held to account. And they also are interested in a conversation with the Black arts movement and the ways in which women are sort of doubly excluded, women of colour are doubly excluded. On the one hand, the women's movement often ignoring or overlooking the needs of women of colour, and on the other, the Black arts movement denigrating women's work. So there is a number of different kind of conversations that are at work within the protest movements, where groups both work together and critique and question the logic of other people's activism in order to try and put forward a different or a more intersectional view. So yes, could I get the next one, please? Activism also exists outside the art world. It's not just about museums and galleries. These are silk-screened slogans and posters that the group Women Artists in Revolution make for marches for choice, reproductive choice in New York. So they're also contributing to a visual language of activism more broadly, women working together in much more active ways, designing and developing products that can be used as part of a kind of activist action politically. So I think it's important to think about not just artistic activism, but also broader women's movement activism that emerges that artists are involved in. So can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So my next way of thinking about activism and collectives and what they do is the notion of support and promotion. These are slides which were part of the Women's Art Registry, a New York-based collection of women's work that involved women artists giving slides from of their own work, up to 5, which were kept in a collection that curators, artists, art historians could access in order to see the wealth of work being made by women. This was something you could kind of select, you could volunteer yourself to be a part of. It was run by people who were involved in the ad hoc Women Artists Committee, and the idea was that curators had long said, oh, there are no women doing minimalist work, for example, or conceptual work, and this was kind of a 600 slide rebuttal to that. They create these networks in order to not only promote women's work, but also to give women a sense of community. So while this isn't a collective in terms of people literally meeting in space, these are women artists from all over America and globally. Women are contributing. But it's about the idea of people caring about your work, which is a really important thing for women artists at this moment, and a kind of collective practice. It's about recognizing, supporting, and promoting other people's work because the art world fails to do so. It's kind of more nebulous, I think, as a kind of collective practice, but still really, really important. The sense that somebody cares that you're an artist is something that is really valuable in the 1970s to getting that recognition. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We also get kind of newsletters and conversations between smaller groups, so small local groups who then talk about what they've been doing in these sort of national networks. This is a page from West East Bag, which was a newsletter essentially that women artists produced in local groups and was sent across particularly America, but also there were groups in Iran, in India, in Hong Kong, Israel, Italy, London, Germany. So it had a kind of global reach, although it was predominantly American. And these are the consciousness-raising rules that the group in San Francisco proposed that talk about how to run your consciousness-raising women artists group. Consciousness-raising is a broader women's liberation movement practice. It's a part of the basis for how that political movement works. And so this is giving women artists who haven't perhaps come from that background guidelines on how to come together, how to share their experience, and how to create that group conversation that can drive work and help cement the collective work. So this is a kind of sharing, national sharing, which helps build collectivity locally. And I think that's really worth thinking about in terms of support, like ways of doing work, ways of helping each other, ways of being collective. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. There's also exhibition practices where people form essentially groups of exhibiting artists, again, not working directly with each other to make artwork, but instead repeatedly exhibiting their work together. This is a poster from Where We At Black Women Artists from their 1972 exhibition at Wayusi Gallery. They're formed in 1971 at the Nigel Jackson Gallery Acts of Art, where there is a reaction to a show of black art that homogenizes black art. that homogenizes the work of the Black Arts movement and presents a very There's a number of responses to it. Kay Brown, Ringgold, and they go to Nigel Jackson and they ask to show their work as a group of women artists of colour who want to see black women's art shown more. Do you want to swap? Sorry. Hello, is that better? Okay. So we'll find out if it's me that can't work a microphone or whether it's the microphone. We will, to be determined. So they show together in a number of different exhibitions. They also have a public programs aspect to the work. They work with children, they work with people who are in prison, and they also continue to promote and display their own work. This is interesting to me because a lot of my focus is on the women artists movement in the 70s and the ways in which that works. They identify themselves very much outside of that. This is a conversation with the Black Arts movement. They see the women's movement as being a white women's movement and something that doesn't reflect their concerns and interests. So while they're certainly in some ways involved and connected to the women's movement, Faith Ringgold is a really key figure in the women's movement in the arts. They also are not interested in being seen as explicitly part of that. And I think that those tensions are really interesting and valuable and important to hold central when we're thinking about collective practice. Who gets to be in the collective and who doesn't is really important. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And that, I think A.I.R Gallery, as Catherine was saying, can be thought about in this way too. It's a supportive network, although itself criticised for its treatment of women of colour, particularly Howardina Pindell has critiques that she leaves because she says she's subject to what we call now microaggressions. And so it's certainly, again, a representation of those kind of tensions, but working on the basis of mutual support, mutual recognition, and encouragement for each other's work. A kind of open, to some degree, open space where women can be seen and shown professionally. So I just wanted to sort of bring it back to that. Can I have the next slide, please? And just to finish off, I wanted to think about what happened when people work together in terms of making work together. And for that, I wanted to think about what happens on the West Coast, this quite well-known history, I think, of the feminist art program and Woman House, and how that then leads into collective practice. So Woman House, for those of you who haven't come across it or who need a refresher, is an outcome of the feminist art program that happens in the California Institute of Arts, run by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shiparo. They run a program which is based on kind of consciousness-raising activities. Women share their experiences as women, particularly as students, talking about what it's like to be a woman in the 1970s, living in America. And then they create installations and performances out of that conversation. You can see they're quite... They deal with quite explicitly feminist questions. We have Vicky Hodgett's eggs, which look like breasts attached to the wall in the kitchen. We have also brides. We have people talking about their experience of motherhood and so on as part of that conversation. And it leads to a kind of collaborative practice, which is about people working together and sharing their experiences. Can I have the next slide, please? And I wanted to sort of finish off with this idea of the kind of active collaborative process. So this is an image of the feminist art workers' performance, Heaven and Hell, based on a story that one of their grandmothers would tell them, I think Nancy Angelo, about how there are two tables laid out. One is heaven and one is hell. Each has a 4-foot fork and a wealth of food that is delicious and wonderful. And in heaven or in hell, you try to pick up the food with a fork and you can't get it in your mouth, as illustrated. And in heaven, everybody feeds each other. So the idea is a particularly kind of straightforward morality tale about how working together can create these kind of utopian experiences. Can I have the next slide, please? And so they work together, they do a number of performances, they travel around and sort of get by a VW van, and they travel around to various women's conferences and create performances together which are about trying to thematize and imagine something for the movement. It's a political practice that is about women's experience, but it's about their shared experience together and how they develop that. Not without its tensions, not without its difficulties, but I think, again, something that points to the ways in which working together can create something valuable and exciting for those involved and for their audiences. And so I just wanted to end with these two quotes, which come from two members of the feminist art workers, which talk about like how collaboration works. The idea that you have to give generously, I think, really important in order to make a successful collaborative practice. It's something where you have to be willing to give something of yourself over in order to gain that recognition from other people and produce something exciting. And I think this quote from Sherry Gork, which is what I'll finish with, is really something that shows the value and the potential of working together, where she says, collaboration was a means of production, but at its best, it was also the living, breathing embodiment of a culture transformed. In many ways, it represented our utopian vision of the world, where people were truly equal and everyone's contribution was valued. So with that, I will pass back over. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think you deserve your own little round of applause there for that amazing whistle-stop tour through collectives. Thank you. That's created so many jumping off points for us about. I think we've definitely identified the dodgy microphone. For us to think about what it might mean to be in a collective today. Could I pass that to you, and you might pass it along to... Thank you so much. So within those strands, I think that principle of activism is really interesting, that hasn't really gone away. There's still a necessity for activism, and I'm keen to speak to Roxana and Adelaide now, who are founder members of InFems Collective, to hear their sort of what kind of cauldron InFems Collective was born out of. Is there still that increased need for activism today, for women to come together to insist as artists on their right to visibility, their right to exhibitions, their right to literally being seen? And I'm really interested in the crossovers that you're illuminating there with art practice within these female collectives, not just being about making art. In some ways, the art making is the afterthought. In a way, it's about these ways of being together and it's about instigating change. So I wonder, shall we start with Roxana, Adelaide? Roxana, do you want to... so I wonder, do any of those themes respond to thinking about how InFems started as a collective that drew on some of these ideas about coming together to create and collaborate?
I think, like most things do, it came out of conversations between persons who felt that there was a kind of inadequate mechanism for working together and for communicating with other people. Should I? Yeah. So really, it out of a series of conversations. I'm not going to trust that. We've got a question. So, in a nutshell, it started with a walk in the park, like so many things do, between myself and Wendy Elia. So I should introduce who InFems, Intersectional Feminist Art Collective, actually are. So it's myself, Roxana Halls, Adelaide Damoah, Wendy Elia, artist, Rebecca Fontaine-Wolfe, also an artist, and Marianne Mancio, who's an art historian and writer. We're the 5 founder members. So Wendy and I, in a walk in the park, whenever we had walks in the park, the subject we'd often return back to was, couldn't more women work together? Couldn't more people work together? And couldn't there be more honest and open conversations about our lives as artists? And it's one of the key things that artists tend to do when they connect up with one another is they want to talk about what they've been through and the obstacles that they've faced. It's kind of an inevitability. I can't recall any time when artists have come together, particularly female artists, where they haven't quite fervently desired to communicate to one another and almost warn one another. And I often feel like it's a kind of extension of me too, to be really frank about what we've experienced, and in particular, misogynistic experiences that we've encountered in the art world, because inevitably, we're all going to come upon that. And we both kind of just thought, isn't there some way that we could do this? Couldn't we talk about potentially getting together and forming some kind of a group to facilitate conversations and work together and put on exhibitions, but primarily to have these open conversations that we were having quite naturally. Wendy suggested we bring on board Rebecca Fontaine-Wolfe. We'd both worked with her. She curated a show at Gallery Different in central London, so we thought that was a great idea. Rebecca suggested Adelaide, who was also in the show that she curated that I was in, so we were in that show together. And Wendy suggested that we bring in Marianne, who was her friend for over 20 years. So together, initially, we just thought we'd have a chat in my studio about working together, and then that developed into a conversation about starting a collective. And then that conversation happened at Adelaide's home and studio, where we as a collective were formally ratified in February 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, which, presented obstacles for us all, did it not? We were all Marianne was not physically present at that meeting. And we live in different countries, so that's problematic, inevitably. But, if the pandemic has done anything, it's enabled us to find ways to work together and communicate together.
Racing together. So do we have a cue? Responding to misogyny, this idea of consciousness raising as women artists coming together. So we see that crossover from arts and life and sort of experiences coming together. But what would you say the ambitions are for InFems? What are you trying to do apart from be there from one another? Is there a change you're trying to activate?
Multiple. Yeah, I think they're multiple. We have a working practice where we bring ideas in collectively and curate our own shows. So we take it in turns to curate a show which we're passionate about, on a subject that we're passionate about, and work with galleries. And we've mounted exhibitions both in the UK and overseas. But primarily, there's multiple aims, and they grow and they develop as we have ongoing conversations and work with other people. But the central idea is that we will mount exhibitions and we will invite artists from that local area to exhibit with us so that we can broaden our network and forge new conversations, new connections between ourselves and other artists. And then in doing that, we can facilitate conversations between us. I mean, we're all very different. We all have these essential differences.
Well, maybe we could talk about that, because I think that's a good moment to sort of think about difference, if now is the time.
Yeah.
Because to set up an intersectional feminist art collective is not a common gesture. I can't think of many others. I can't think of many. I mean, we talked about, Rachel highlighted some of the tensions within approach, or these tensions in the ambition for intersectionality. Adelaide, you'd like to talk a bit about that? I know when I spoke to both of you prior to this, we talked about ideas of vulnerability within collectives and the necessity for vulnerability, but also and that's one of the themes that we keep coming back to within this radical female joy programming, is the idea of a radical vulnerability that takes us to the next stage, whether that's with finding joy, with finding some kind of political visibility. And so I think it's a really, fundamental thing to acknowledge. Can I pass over here? Try with this mic.
Yeah, hello. I'm Adelaide Damoah. I'm one of the founding members of InFems Collective, and I'm also one of the founding members of the BBFA Collective, the Black British Female Artists Collective. We were established in 2015. And one of my aims in terms of working with the InFems Collective was to hopefully be the bridge between black women and white women when it comes to talking about feminism specifically, because a lot of black women don't necessarily identify with feminism as a movement for reasons which are very well documented historically. Some black women will prefer to think of them as womanist, Alice Walker's pass the mic. As per Alice Walker's original overarching idea about thinking about feminism and womanism as this all-encompassing thing that centers black women's invisibility and black women's issues, and women of colour's issues, because of that central tenet that we're not all free. We cannot all be free unless my sisters are all free, right? So, and at the time when Alice Walker was thinking about this, black women were just at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of feminist discourse. And so this idea that starting from the struggles of black women who think about other things in addition to just sexism, because of the fact of the intersection of race with sex, that we can get to a point where we are able to help so many other people to be free, and not just white women, which was one of the criticisms of the white feminist movement. But going back to this idea of difference, this is the second talk that I've had with you whereby I've brought one of my Bibles, which is "All your Lords, your silence will not protect you." And I just wanted to just touch on a couple of really interesting ideas that she talks about in she's got one essay, which is The Erotic as Power, the Power of the Erotic. And there's another one which speaks specifically about violence. And in both of those, she talks about the importance of difference and the importance of recognizing difference, because if we ignore difference, which is one of the founding tenets of intersectionality in the first place, then certain people who are marginalized are going to inevitably be ignored, and this is borne out in history. So I will start with where she talks about difference and joy specifically. She says, The erotic is the nurturer or nursemaid of all of our deepest knowledge. The erotic functions for me in several ways, and the first is in providing the power which comes from sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. The sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of their difference, which is where my thinking was in terms of forming that bridge between the BBFA collective, for example, and the intersectional feminist collective. And unfortunately, that's one of the difficult things for me personally, is that I haven't been able to do that thus far. And that is in part because of legitimate concerns that the BBFA have and other Black British female artists have in terms of working with white feminist artists, or white feminists full stop. And then she goes on to, there's another essay actually called Age, Race and Class. And that's another thing. One of our members, Wendy, is significantly older than all of us. And that's, I think, an issue that is not discussed enough, is ageism in feminist discourse when we're talking about these things. So I just wanted to briefly mention that before going on to read this section. How do we redefine difference for all women? It is not our differences which separate women, but our reluctance to recognize those differences and to deal effectively with the distortions which have resulted from the ignoring and misnaming of those differences, which is really important when she goes on in this next section on anger. We've been raised to view any difference other than sex as a reason for destruction, and for Black women and white women to face each other's angers without denial or immobility or silence or guilt is itself a heretical and generative idea. It implies peers meeting upon a common basis to examine difference and to alter those distortions which history has created around our difference. For it is those distortions which separate us. And we must ask ourselves, who profits from this? And then finally, the last section, sorry, this is not like, I'm not up on my pulpit preaching. I just feel like this is so important in terms of this conversation. And here she's talking about anger in her essay on anger, difference and anger, leading to change. But anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification, for it is in the painful process of this translation that we identify who are our allies, with whom we have grave differences, and who are our genuine enemies. And then she goes on to say, finally, anger is loaded with information and energy. When I speak of women of colour, I do not only mean Black women. The women of colour who is not Black, who charges me with rendering her invisible by assuming that her struggles with racism are identical with my own, has something to tell me that I had better learn from, lest we both waste ourselves fighting the truths between us. And that goes for conversations between women of colour and white women as well, as far as I'm concerned. If I participate knowingly or otherwise in my sister's oppression and she calls me on it, to answer her anger with my own only blankets the substance of our exchange with reaction. It wastes energy. And yes, it is very difficult to sit and stand still and to listen to another woman's voice delineate an agony I do not share, of one to which I myself have contributed. And I think those things are so important to center in any feminist conversations when it comes to kind of in the art world, trying to carve out a space for ourselves, trying to fight the fight that we're fighting at the moment. And I think it's a dangerous position to think that because some people, you have tokenism, or you have the superstar effect, when more and more women are being written about now. But if you actually look at the statistics of what's happening in institutions, hasn't really changed that much. We do live in exciting times in that things are changing, And we have so many writers and thinkers and galleries who are putting in the hard work to ensure that women of colour, trans women are given a voice and are represented equally, but there's still a hell of a lot of work to do, and it's important to centre some of these things in that conversation and not move away from the idea of anger as well, because anger can be a real driving force towards change.
Thanks, Adelaide. I think I love that Adelaide brings her Audre Lorde Bible with her. It's the second she mentioned. It's the second time we've joined it. But thank you for reading those passages. There's just a couple of things that really struck me, and I know we've spoken about this before. And just to reiterate what you said about the productive power of anger, of being able to face differences, and for it not to destroy us, and to find a sisterhood, a bridge of sisterhood through that, even if we are going to have difficult conversations coming from our different points. And I think that's something that we are very quick to smooth over, especially in a culture in which there's so much opportunity for criticism, opportunity to shut things down, social media discourses and rhetoric, where we can be afraid to let the right sort of anger be productive. And the thing that you said there, mentioning Audre Lorde, about how when black women and white women come together and face those angers, it's almost heretical. It's something that the system, whatever that system might be, doesn't want to happen, because it means that it will go somewhere and something will change. There are interests in keeping women siloed in their different groups and not coming together collectively to embrace change through anger and through difficult conversations. And I think, we can talk about perhaps in a moment, and I want to give some time to Elli as well now to talk about models of working in representing women, specifically within the art market. But before we move on to that, I wanted to think about, I can't remember what I wanted to think about now. It was to do with, it'll come back to me, but we're thinking about, the productivity of anger, but thinking about the way in which we historicise these collectives, the things that get left out, those conversations that happened that get erased in the writing down of our art histories. We were talking about Emma Amos, the black artist who joined the Heresies Collective. And did you want to talk a little bit, comment on that and your sort of surprise? I think you had a really good quote by Emma Amos saying how she was surprised how her animosity towards white feminism evaporated when she joined the Heresies Collective.
Because it was the CRC, what they called again? Combahee River Collective, exactly. So I read somewhere that this Combahee River Collective, who are not an arts activist group, they were the 60s, 70s, right? They were a general activist group who were interested in race and gender as well, and how all of those things intersected. And this Heresies Collective would produce essays and in journals. I think it was, how often was it? But yeah, depending on the year. Yes. And the criticism that the Combahee Collective had was that it was racist, and it left out lesbians basically completely from the conversation in terms of artists, and this criticism led them to then go on and produce more issues that dealt with those specific issues, and so the history that I was reading was more about that kind of controversy and those accusations of racism and exclusion. And so I was very surprised when I was I read something about Emma Amos. And the quote was specifically that when she joined as a member of Heresies, that her animosity for white feminists disappeared. And that was really nice and encouraging for me to read.
Thanks, Adelaide. I think while we're talking about race, it's also important to talk about sexuality and coming from a space of marginalisation within sexuality. And I wonder if, Roxana, you would be happy to talk about that within the collective and that as a position which you operate from within it.
Well, I think it's quite hard to speak about that, really. I think partly because in an operational sense, it's our points of contact, it's our points of connectedness that I really want to come to the fore and that I want to consider. But inevitably, as someone who is a lesbian and who has encountered significant homophobia, including in my own family, significantly in my own family, the idea of collectedness, anything that resembles a family unit is a fraught business and is not a place for safe discussion, openness and hopefulness, to be really frank. So I think when you come from that experience, your hopefulness about how you can enact change and meet with any kind of positive outcome is very limited. But I think, but equally, like most gay people, your desire for a chosen family is very strong, and it's something that a lot of us share. The sense that, well, if it's possible, then we want to try and forge those connections. But very often, you do feel inevitably, if you're part of a kind of minority group, you're regarded as such. There's aspects to your very being and enacting your life, inhabiting your life, which become political de facto. You don't necessarily need to be a political animal. You are a political animal just by the fact of being. And it means that you have certain points of connection with people that you'll never know. I think that's one of the really central purposes in trying to do anything that's visible. I mean, we have more potential for that online now than we ever used to have, inevitably, but that's fraught. Because our ability to contact one another and communicate openly with one another and show ourselves honestly is inhibited by the very mechanism of social media. I mean, I came here to a talk during the censorship show because, I mean, one of the best things about being part of a collective is the people who contact you, who want to connect with you, either because of you as an individual and the work that you do and what you speak to, or just the very fact that you exist. It means that I always want to moderate my aims or not be self-aggrandizing about what we are and what we can achieve. But you do become a kind of beacon. Just the fact that you're even trying to do something collectively that's useful means that people reach out to you. And a good example of that is that Emma Shapiro, who was the chair of a talk here about censorship, contacted us and asked one of us to come along. So I came along, and it was a fascinating talk. And she was talking about many things, myriad things, but one of the things that she was discussing was a shadow ban on Instagram. Does anyone know about this? I mean, we all know that people have been banned, and this is a real issue for so many women who are making work about the female body. Just showing the female body is verboten. It's a fraught area. It's shadow ban. I knew nothing about this until I came along to this talk, and it was so horrifying to me. And there was someone in the audience who said that that she had been shadow banned by Instagram just for trying to connect with other people to talk about abortion and about abortion rights. So just using terminology about women's bodies in that context meant that she was being silenced. So we still have a need for it. So some of us feel deeply that we have a need for a chosen family, even when we haven't had an experience of having a good one. But there's that feeling of the familial feeling that you can have with people that you absolutely don't know. that you don't know. And you can't necessarily engender that on your own. It takes more people.
I wonder, both of you might comment on the thing of not working hierarchically and maybe how your experience has been in what that's like in practice, because to not have one central identity, we know about histories of feminist collectives where it was a nightmare producing something like the Heresies Journal because everyone had time to have their say. You have to create such a big space in order for everybody to be able to make their contribution. I just wondered whether you were able to comment frankly on on that horizontality within a collective, your experience of it working or not working.
Well, we make all decisions, all the chief decisions for the collective we make together. So we don't decide to do a show, we don't decide to undertake an enterprise without communicating as a group. Obviously there's 5 of us. It's very difficult, partly because of logistics. Rebecca lives in Lisbon, Marianne lives in Italy, Wendy's in Devon, we're in London, so that's quite tricky. But yeah, the chief decisions we all take together. But we've been operational since 2020, and then the pandemic happened, so inevitably, we haven't been going that long, and the way that we operate will evolve. It's going to necessarily evolve. But yeah, inevitably, some people are more embroiled in the actual day-to-day running of things, and there's a lot of admin. It's a lot of work, and we have our own careers, and we're very busy. So how we prioritize our time and how we get together is very tricky. Yeah.
Horizontal collectives really have this horizontality of direction that's require maybe a lot more space, a lot more commitment, a lot more time. Maybe we can use that as a jumping off point to think about another type of model which is unusual in the art world in terms of the commercial gallery. Talking to Elli Jason Foster, who's the director of Gillian Jason Gallery, because when your mother founded the gallery in the 80s, was it, I believe, after a career as a ballerina, she was bringing a new model to the West End Gallery of a woman running a gallery and exhibiting women artists. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what that moment was like.
I'm not sure this is right. Yeah, just so we can
I think just to kind of address some of the really important issues that have been talked about so far when I've been listening to Roxana or indeed to Adelaide, and what I understand, from our position, actually, from where I am, from where Gillian, my mother, was, is that we were very much middle-class, white, cisgendered women with all the trappings that go along with that. And when Gillian set up the gallery, it was momentous because she did do it as a pioneer, but she didn't realize, I don't think, that she was that pioneer. I think somehow just the effort of seeing a gap in the market, seeing a position that she might be able to exploit, she did exactly that. And if you think about it, it wasn't really a West End gallery. It was a home in Camden Town that she specifically took the ground floor and turned it into, a space which was empty with walls that she could fill with art from artists who lived in Camden Town, the environment around her, whether it was, Auerbach or Stanley Spencer and Hilda Carline, or whether she went further afield and identified Frances Hodgkins, and she very much, wanted to work with the women who were also in the lives of the artists, the modern British artists, the women of the 30s and 40s and 50s that she loved so much, David Bomberg, Lillian Holt, and so on. But was she really understanding of the themes of the world that was so important to us now. I'm not entirely sure that that was her driving force. When it became apparent that the gallery would die out if somebody didn't pick up and run with it, Millie, my daughter, was not interested in the career that she had been doing to date. There was some reason for me also to maybe take a different path. I had worked at Christie's and obviously grown up with this gallery at home. And we decided that, coming from a strong line of women, that we should focus on the art and the conversation that we wanted to have. I'd worked in the world of men forever, and I thought there was something wrong with me. I didn't understand most of the time what people were talking about. I didn't realize that perhaps that was to do with a patriarchal world that I didn't agree with. And I'm really pleased to hear you say that Emma Amos, opened this discourse and found that actually it lessened her anger towards white feminist artists. And what I find is the most important thing that Millie and I can do in the gallery today is to continue conversation all the time. And of course, what we find is difficult, and we do find it difficult, we come up against, we haven't had the opportunity to come up against non-binary artists and lesbian artists to the same extent as we have Black artists of colour, and we've had a kind of textural feel of those conversations, which have often been quite difficult, and they resonate with us. And they don't always go to the end degree, perhaps, where change might be affected within a short amount of time, but for sure we're able to have the conversations, and I feel that is hopefully helping to make a difference somewhere.
I guess it's nice to think about as well, maybe I romanticize this idea, but I love the idea of it being a grandmother, then daughter and granddaughter, and that genealogy, which is a term I like to use when thinking about histories of feminism as well, and the importance of that. I think Griselda Pollock is always talking about the importance of remembering our mothers, remembering our grandmothers, and I think there's something in there about maybe our generation's attachment to the work of the 1970s, which would be our mother's generation, sort of roughly speaking, and that, maybe that interest among scholars and researchers now for thinking of that moment of the 70s into the early 80s, which would have been our childhood, but our mother's kind of moment, or our symbolic mother's moment. And in so many of the collectives that I've been interested in, there is this acknowledgement of the symbolic mother, not necessarily the biological mother, but the figures that came before. And so I'm really enchanted by the idea of having that network that you have in place as a way of selling, promoting art, operating as a gallery, and that something being passed down through a matriarchal line when, as I think you've alluded to, it's a pretty patriarchally dominated system of a boys' club in the traditional gallery model. So I'd just love to hear if you had any reflections on that.
I think that, Roxana, you touched upon family relationships and so on. So obviously there are those relationships that are difficult to have conversations between mother and daughter, perhaps between my mother and myself, and now with myself and Millie. But what there is always is a feeling of joy the joy of the lineage, of the overwhelming passion that has come down through the lines. So whenever days are difficult, or moments are difficult, or choices are difficult, I often fall back upon this idea that, I came from somewhere with strength that embodied the idea that as a woman you could take on just as much as anybody else in the world, no matter what gender or race and so on. So for that, I'm eventually so grateful, because it is at the core of everything that we do. But I think hand in hand with conversation, hand in hand with understanding that you're up against the patriarchy, hand in hand with understanding that there is more to be given. There is more to be given. And actually, that also is something that I feel incredibly strongly, that I was given an opportunity, that we were given this ability to stand up and have something that can allow us to speak for ourselves. I think I'm passionate about that. It's winning. It's been amazing.
This might be the time to see if there's any questions. Pass over to the audience. You've been listening to us for about an hour now, so patiently. During the questions, do feel free to get another drink from the bar. I think the bar is still in operation if you want to discreetly get yourself something else. Do we have any questions on the floor? Yes. Can we pass the microphone? Is there a microphone at the back there?
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for your time and sharing your thoughts. This is a question for the panel overall. I don't know who's the best to answer. But is there anything you do in your programs, in your collectives, that addresses the issue of class? Because I think we've touched a little bit on race, but I think class is also quite an important issue. And I say that because I work at Tate and I work with patrons. And even though in theory, patronage is open to everyone, I'm well aware that... I'll continue, okay. I'm aware that even some of our lowest levels of support are just not accessible to everyone. And yet those people still need to be represented, they are still valued, we still need them to be part of what we do. So in the work that you do, is there a way that you feel you can successfully address issues of class for people who perhaps wouldn't even be in this room today, but are very much still important?
Such a wonderful question. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Roxana to answer that. And before I do so, I completely agree with your point. I think in the conversations that we have about intersectionality, class is very often the one that gets left out of the equation. From my perspective, I am working on some part of our program on working class joy, which draws on my own reflection on getting to the position that I'm in now from where I started. And I think, Roxana, you've got things to say about how that works within the collective, haven't you, and your own perspective?
We could talk about this at great length. I'm working class. I'm from a working class background. I'm often saying most people know that I'm a lesbian, but they don't know that I'm working class, because it is the thing that people don't communicate enough about. And it's rare, it's still relatively rare to encounter other working class people in the art world. But again, this is partly what's really interesting about trying to create spaces where we can get together and communicate about the obstacles that we've all faced, and specifically to talk about forms of difference which are not visible. Between us as a collective, just as a group of 5 women, the differences between us and our experiences are really significant, and we bring these things to bear and bring these things into our conversations. Being working class is one of mine. I think it's really important not to create a hierarchy of differences. It's very difficult to do, inevitably, because we all have our chief concerns. But I think, again, talking about what connects us as feminists is really critical. But it's one of the really important things that we can do when we come together and we create spaces for open conversation, is to be really candid. And sometimes that feels intensely perilous. I mean, I feel that as somebody that grew up in a scenario where I couldn't speak and couldn't speak about what was truthful about myself. And I do think it's one of the great gifts that we can give to one another is to be really, really frank about how we've managed to carve a life. You know, so much of my work is about women trying to forge their way forward and create a life and to enable one another to do so somehow. But so often for so many people, lots of my imagery is about women getting away with things. And when people talk about, you know, what do you consider to be your greatest success, I often say getting away with it. Because so often forging a life for yourself can feel like pulling off a heist. And so many women feel that. And inevitably, if you're brought up in difficult economic circumstances, then you can feel that all the more. So I'll talk about one of the exhibitions that we did. So myself and Marianne co-curated a show in Leicester. It was our first show in the UK. And when we came to think about how we would curate that show, inevitably we looked at the place where we were going to exhibit. We came to exhibit there because of a connection that Rebecca had. And we looked at Leicester, and one of the main things that we couldn't not notice was that Leicester, I mean, we all think of Leicester as Richard III's bones now, inevitably, but, you know, Leicester, 40% of the population of Leicester are below the poverty line. And we both thought what we really care about is trying to get people to come and exhibit with us who might not necessarily have the opportunity to do so, or might not necessarily feel that they're able to put themselves forward to exhibit with people that they don't know. You know, so many women work in a kind of disconnected, cloistered, modular way. They don't know one another. People can be in the same small city and not know one another, not work together. And one of the chief issues with class is just feeling that opportunities might be there, but they're not available for you. They're not for you. You can't have them. You can't reach for them. You're not entitled to them. And I know this deeply from my looking back on my younger self. Just a feeling of, I know there are things there, but how on earth could someone like me make this life? So I think one of the chief things we can do practically is not just to rely on our own networks. And it's so easy to do that, to talk to our friends, to talk among the people that we already know, rather than to make an effort and to try to connect with people that we couldn't possibly know. And the fact is, most people who are working class will not know a lot of the people that you know in the art world, and will not feel that it's even possible to make a life. So actually, Wendy was brilliant, and, you know, we said she wanted to help, and while we were curating the show, we really wanted the show to be about trying to connect with local artists in Leicester, but to exhibit emerging artists, but to not just exhibit them, not just invite them to exhibit with us, but also to do some mentoring with them and to do some supporting of them, if they wanted that, so that we could have a conversation and be available to them and have a session with them and talk to them about what their aims were, how we could help them. And it was just gorgeous. But so Wendy made a real effort to contact local institutions, local universities, arts groups, research. I mean, obviously I looked into it as well to try and think, who could we contact? How can we reach out to people? Not just talk to the gallery themselves. Who do you know? Which artists do you know? But to try to connect with people that they weren't even aware of. But the fact is, you know, we did it a kind of, you know, we put it out there on social media. We did an open call. We asked people to submit. We reached out. We spoke to universities. We contacted arts organisations, and we still didn't get as much, because even then, who are you? I understand that. Who are you coming in here and wanting to talk to us? But also, you know, what is this even for me? It's the vulnerability, and but you do have to speak way beyond your own existing networks. But it ended up being such a fantastic enterprise. And we've continued to maintain contact with those artists, one of whom is here, and one of the artists we show within Leicester, but I don't want to embarrass her by pointing her out. Unless she wants to raise her hand, but that's up to her. Yay! This is Lucy Cade, everyone. It's so nice to see you. At the time, it was just fantastic to talk to you about your work and to get to know you a bit more. And, we really want to do a range of other things in tandem with this, in connection with this, and to offer opportunities and residencies potentially to artists. So at the time, we asked the artists, would you be interested potentially in having a residency with Marianne in Italy and coming to visit the art in that area and spend some time, so economically, for so many artists, it's so difficult just to forge a tiny pocket of time where you can make some work without economic concerns and without the constraints of family very often. And Lucy, only recently, you had your residency with Marianne in Italy, and it was great. You produced some wonderful work, and Lucy is now having an exhibition, which I think includes some of that work, at the Crypt Gallery, opening this Friday. Is that right? Bravo. Bravo.
Any other? Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, over there. Shall we pass you the microphone? Thanks.
Hello. Mine's a practical question about working as a collective and how you organise your time and labour together. And I'm guessing you're juggling lots of other things in life. And just especially as like you're working with people in different countries and different parts of England as well, and just like practically how that works, and any advice on
that? It's difficult, but email, constant communication. We have a WhatsApp group, and things are often discussed on the WhatsApp group. And then if it gets to decision time, then it goes to email. Then we have Zoom meetings. It's kind of impossible to have in-person meetings, given that 2 of our members live abroad. So we more often than not have Zoom meetings to make final decisions. And then just reaching out to people, email and phone. It's not complicated, it's just,
Requires commitment, doesn't
yes,
it?
yeah.
I think when you think about the, there's maybe in the groups that you've been involved in researching, Rachel, there's also that sort of priority of time and that thing of people, how do you fit it all in? It becomes a lifestyle, doesn't it, for that kind of activism within a collective. I'm just thinking about the Milan Women's Bookstore and how they said everyone worked half a day so that there was never any imposition on individuals' times, and so they found that, but then that's a really fractional way of working, which then impacts the sorts of things you can do. So I think it's all part and parcel of what the methods of labour, I believe, then reflect on the sorts of work you can produce and the sorts of positions you can occupy. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think just responding to that, I think that it depends on what you want to achieve and how revolutionary or utopian your ambitions are. I mean, like, I work together on curatorial stuff, and I don't think that's collective practice, but it involves a lot of those same things. Like, my partner is based in Ireland, so it's like the kind of practicalities of trying to work together for anybody is complicated. But if you're trying to do something like the feminist art workers, where you just basically abandon your life and you live together and you do everything together, it's a very different kind of model than the kind of A.I.R gallery where everyone signs up to a schedule, And so I think, but if you look at the kind of conversations around working together. There is the kind of practicalities, but there's also about those questions you were talking about, leadership and non-hierarchical structures, and they are something that is thought about in great detail as part of the women's liberation movement. And Joe Freeman publishes a text called The Tyranny of Structuralistness, which argues for hierarchy of some kind, which doesn't say that person is in charge, but that someone needs to direct things and make decisions, and all those things that can be complicated by trying to work together and trying to undermine or like not have particular roles. So I think it depends what you're trying to achieve and how that works. I think often it doesn't. Often people try to work together and it collapses after a year or two. But that doesn't mean that that year or two isn't a really important and valuable thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really, for me, I think a really important takeaway to think that when things fail, that's also okay. And, you know, like with conversations that we have in Bridging Difference, when they fail, it's not a reason to abandon. When collective action fails, or the failures of it and the moments of failure, of anger, of disappointment, is not necessarily, maybe it does lead to abandonment, but it doesn't mean that that wasn't productive. And I think we're so scared of something going wrong. And especially, like I was saying at the beginning, the stakes are really high for women's production or women's feminist activity, whether it's as artists, as writers, as curators. Women aren't really allowed to fail very often. And so creating that possibility for failure is actually quite radical and allowing for that. Any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to remind you of the Women's Artists Slide Library, which seemed to coordinate quite a lot of this activity in the 70s. Of course, it did exactly your problem. It failed because everything became digitised. But I don't know if it's back, but it seemed to be a catalyst for a lot of strong feminist activity.
Yeah. There's like there's that question of things becoming obsolete, like obsolete media formats like the slide, and what do we lose within the archive when we transfer everything onto digital? Did you want to?
Absolutely, that's a really important and valuable history, especially for here. And this kind of remnants of it are in Goldsmiths. The feminist art library there has the archives and the magazines that were made. They produced a magazine called Make until I think the 2000s, and so that kind of produces not only a record of the work but also conversations around it. But yeah, a similar kind of drive to work together. A number of artists who kind of did that kind of collective organising practice to support women based in the UK. Yeah, and so really worth that history is really worth looking into. And if you want to going to see the originals in Goldsmiths is really an interesting thing to do. Absolutely.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
I'm interested in each of the panel members. What does the future look like?
The future of everything, or the future of collective action? Yeah. Who wants to start with that? I don't.
I do, because I'm very excited about the future. I also wanted to actually just address something else that we spoke about. Nothing, obviously, endeavour is never easy, and I'm not going to suggest it is for 1 minute, but ideas, good ideas, great ideas are always the best currency. And I think that the art world and perhaps the business of artists, there is such a leveler there, because it doesn't matter where you're from and what your background is, but if you have a great idea, then you're going to, and you keep going, you're going to make it. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that there is so much life to be had in this new way that we're fashioning forward, and I'm really excited about the exhibitions that I don't even know about yet, that are yet to come.
That was very optimistic. Yeah, I mean, more of the same, and growth, I think, for us as a collective, in terms of, I mean, we're having conversations about the structure and how that's going to work moving forward, because things inevitably will change and grow. I think allowing space for failure as well, like you were saying, and failure to me is not necessarily a negative. Failure allows space for growth. And sometimes it's only in failing that we can really get to a destination that we hadn't even considered before. And yeah, more amazing exhibitions, collaborations, hopefully some kind of incubator program that grows on what we've already done, in terms of the mentoring and things like that. And like Roxana was saying, the residencies, which we are having increasing conversations about, and more collaborations and different collaborations. Like we did a really interesting one with Carolina Herrera this year, which was amazing, and we all got paid from it. So more of that kind of thing, which would be exciting. And obviously we've all got our individual personal projects, and I'm having really exciting conversations about potentially partnering with academic institutions for my work on colonialism. So that's from a personal perspective, which is really exciting for me.
I suppose what I've been thinking about in terms of the collective are the tensions of the collective working within capitalism. And I think that became apparent in the most recent edition of Documenta 15. If you followed the controversy where it was a collection, Ruan Grupa, who took a radically non-hierarchical approach to curating, you know, an international art fair exhibition. It's not really a fair, is it, Documenta? But it's this place on the contemporary art, really on the contemporary art map, and how that disintegrated and became really contentious. And there was this kind of impossibility for these more horizontal methods to work within what still remains a structure of advanced capitalism. So I see the collective as being the personal. Actually, I don't see it always working within the methods of the superstructure of selling and buying art. I see it as the personal, and maybe through the personal, the radically liberating. That's my reflection on a more cynical one, perhaps, or.
Yeah, it's a hard question. It's an interesting question. I think, I think collective practice tends to thrive when things are politically difficult. So I'm not sure that's an optimistic thing, but I think collective practice will grow because things are bad. I agree that I think the buying and selling of collective work, there have been a number of people who've looked at it and have tried to. It's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult just in terms of logistics, who owns work when it's made collectively. So I agree that I don't think that the art market quite knows what to do with that. But I think that collective practice often kind of exceeds and isn't interested in that specific sort of success. And to me, that's interesting and exciting. Although it's difficult, as an artist, it's very difficult to sustain that kind of radical practice because you've got to eat. So I think probably more collectives looking at political questions, but against a backdrop of things being awful. I'm not sure that's good, but that's I think what I see.
Yeah. I can't really add anything to any of that. That was all marvellous. I think I hope the future holds funding for InFems intersection, because we need it, and we're a fully self-funding organisation, so you can imagine how difficult that is. I can't add anything more abstractly to that because that's all marvellous, but I'll just talk one of the. I don't want to go. I'll talk about the exciting things we've got coming up. I'm curating a show. I'm very excited about that. And one of the lovely things that we can do is continue working with artists that we've worked with so that our networks are sustained and they build. So I'm inviting one of the artists who we invited for our previous show in Thameside to exhibit with me in my show, which is coming up very soon, but I'm not here to plug that. One of the other really lovely things that we can do as an organisation is to bring something interesting into the group and pool resources to use our collective brain matter. So I'm really happy to announce this evening that I was invited to work with Warchild, which is they're an incredible UK charity. And they deal with the wounds that are not visible in conflict zones throughout the world. They're a really remarkable charity. They asked me if I would be on board, if I would be happy to be on board as an art advisor. And I brought that to InFems and asked if they could, because I know that my colleagues have numerous resources and abilities and capabilities to bring to bear to something like that. So InFems are now art advisors to Warchild, and we're working with them on a really great, potentially really great enterprise for next year. So I'm really proud about that. That's our future.
It's time to just thank our panellists, Roxana Halls, Rachel Warriner, Adelaide Damoah, Elli Jason Foster. We've kept you captive because it's raining, so no one, I think it's lightening off, but do stay for another drink. Thank you so much for all your questions. Thank you for coming out this evening, and we will see you at the next edition of Exploring Radical Female Joy. Thank you.